Captain Zoe Bennett had 13 minutes to decide if her country was under attack. Not 13 minutes to respond. 13 minutes to even know. At 03:47, the monitor in front of Airman Delgado went black without warning. No error, no countdown, nothing. Zoe barely looked up. Systems flickered sometimes. It wasn't worth the coffee getting cold over. Then a second monitor died. Then a third. By 03:51, the board that connected Fort Caldwell to 2,000 soldiers spread across 3 river valleys. Soldiers in the middle of a live field exercise, moving, training, trusting that someone back at base could reach them if something went wrong, was turning red, 1 square at a time. Zoe had run this software update 11 times before. She'd signed off on it herself 4 days earlier in a room full of officers, using the words minimal operational risk. She remembered saying them out loud. Now every one of those words felt like a mistake she couldn't take back. The redundant system, the one built specifically to survive exactly this kind of failure, went dark 60 seconds after the primary. That wasn't supposed to be possible. Redundant systems didn't fail with the thing they were supposed to protect against, unless something wanted them to. By the time Colonel Reyes shoved through the door and asked her the only question that mattered, accident or something worse, Zoe didn't have an answer. She had 2,000 soldiers she couldn't reach. She had 4 hours before command assumed the worst. And somewhere underneath the panic, a colder thought was starting to form. That the only system left that might actually work was one nobody currently serving had ever been trained to use. The first monitor went dark at 03:47. Captain Zoe Bennett almost missed it. She was 3 screens over, watching a progress bar crawl through the final stage of the patch deployment, when Airman Delgado said, "Ma'am, I'm losing the East Relay feed." Losing how? Just gone. No error, no timeout. It's just gone. Zoe rolled her chair over, still holding her coffee, still telling herself this was nothing. Software updates threw tantrums sometimes. A dropped connection here, a service that needed a manual restart there. She'd run this exact patch cycle 11 times in the 18 months she'd commanded the cybersecurity team at Fort Caldwell's Network Operations Center. It was routine. She'd scheduled it for 03:30 specifically because it was supposed to be quiet. A 4-hour maintenance window during the lull between exercise phases, when the joint training units in the field would be resting, not moving, not needing to talk to anyone. By 03:51, 4 more monitors had gone dark. "East relay's down," Delgado said. "So is West. Sergeant Okafor, are you seeing this on the redundant line?" Master Sergeant Grace Okafor didn't answer right away. She was already typing, fast, her jaw tight in a way Zoe had learned meant something real was happening. "Redundant line's not responding either. Ma'am, that's not supposed to happen. Redundant's on a separate power bus, separate switch stack. It's not supposed to go down with the primary." Zoe set the coffee down without drinking it. She pulled up the master status board, the one that gave her a single glance at every secure channel currently active between Fort Caldwell and the units training 40 miles east, spread across 3 river valleys for a division-level field exercise that had been 8 months in planning. 2,000 soldiers out there right now. Convoy movements, live fire ranges, medevac coordination, all of it running through the same secure network she had just updated. The board was turning red 1 square at a time, like something eating its way across a map. "Talk to me," Zoe said, and her voice came out steadier than she felt. "What do we actually know right now?" "We know the update finished pushing at 03:46, Okafor said. "We know 60 seconds later things started dropping. That's not proof of anything, but it's not nothing either. Could it be the patch? Could be a lot of things." Okafor didn't look up from her screen. Could be the patch. Could be something the patch exposed. Could be a coincidence, though I've been doing this 11 years and I don't love coincidences that arrive on schedule. Zoe had run the pre-deployment checks herself. Twice. She'd signed off on the rollout timeline. She'd told Colonel Reyes, in a meeting 4 days ago, that the update carried minimal operational risk. that it was a security patch closing a vulnerability flagged in a routine audit, that the window was chosen specifically to avoid any impact on the exercise. She remembered saying the words minimal operational risk out loud, in a conference room, with people writing it down. She pushed that thought aside. There would be time to feel sick about it later. Right now, there wasn't. Delgado, get me a full list. Every system we've lost, in order, with timestamps. Okafor, I want eyes on the patch logs. I need to know if this is following the update path or jumping around randomly. If it's random, that tells us something. If it's following the path, that tells us something else. They moved. That was the thing about her team. The thing she was proudest of even now, even with her stomach in a knot. They moved. Nobody froze. Nobody asked her if she was sure this was serious, because the room had already answered that question for them. By 0410, there was nothing left. Every secure channel between the Network Operations Center and the field units was silent. Not degraded, not slow. Silent. Somewhere out in those river valleys, company commanders were about to wake up for the day's movements with no way to report positions, no way to call in support, no way to reach anyone back at Caldwell if something went wrong. And nobody at Caldwell had any way to reach them either. Zoe had spent 6 years building a career on the idea that she was the person who kept this from happening. That was the whole job. Not glamorous, not the kind of thing that got written up anywhere, but real. The invisible wall between 2,000 soldiers and the chaos of being unreachable. She had believed, with the kind of quiet confidence she rarely said out loud, that she was good at this. The door to the operations center opened hard enough to bang against the wall. Colonel Marcus Reyes came in already talking. Bennett, tell me why I just got a call from 3rd Brigade asking why they can't raise anyone, and tell me it's not your update. Zoe stood up straight because there was no version of this conversation she could have sitting down. Sir, she said, I don't know yet if it's an accident or something worse. I need a few hours to find out. But right now, sir, we have no communication with anyone in that exercise area. None. Reyes looked at the red board behind her for a long moment. You've got until 0800, he said. After that, I have to assume the worst and start making decisions based on it. I'd rather make them based on what you tell me. Reyes left with a promise to return at 0700 for an update, which gave Zoe exactly 2 hours and 50 minutes to have something real to tell him. She gathered her team around the center console, Okafor, Delgado, and Specialist Nguyen, who'd come in early for a shift change and walked straight into the middle of the outage without a word of complaint. Okay, Zoe said. Let's think like this happened on purpose, and let's think like it happened by accident at the same time. I don't want anyone locking onto one theory yet. Delgado, timeline. Delgado read off his list. 7 systems, all down within 4 minutes of each other, but not in the order the patch had actually been pushed to them. That's the first thing that bothers me, Okafor said. If this was the update breaking something clean and simple, the systems should have failed in deployment order. East went down before West got the patch. That's backwards. Unless the failure isn't in the patch itself, Nguyen said. Unless it's something the patch triggered somewhere else, like it kicked something loose that was already sitting there. Zoe nodded slowly. That was the version of this she wanted to be true, and she made herself notice that she wanted it, because wanting an answer was a bad reason to believe it. Show me the failover logs. If East and West and Redundant all went down independently, there should be 3 different failure signatures. If they went down because of one shared cause, the signatures should look related. It took 40 minutes to pull the logs, because half the systems needed to be reached manually over hardline, since nothing routed automatically anymore. Zoe worked one terminal herself, hands moving fast, glancing at the clock more than she wanted to admit. 2 years ago, during a training rotation at a different post, a communications gap during a river crossing exercise had left a platoon out of contact for 11 minutes. 11 minutes wasn't a disaster. Nobody had been hurt, but Zoe had spent that 11 minutes staring at a blank screen, absolutely certain something terrible was happening and unable to do anything about it, and the feeling had never fully left her. She'd requested the cybersecurity billet at Caldwell partly because she wanted to be the person who made sure that feeling belonged to no one else. She didn't tell her team that story. She'd told almost no one. But she felt it now, underneath the calm voice she was using, like a second pulse. "Ma'am." Okafor turned her screen around. "I've got something." The failure signatures weren't independent. All three systems showed the same authentication handshake failing at nearly the same millisecond, which shouldn't have been possible if the outage were simply the patch behaving badly on separate hardware. "That's not a coincidence," Okafor said. "That's one cause hitting three targets. Could the patch itself have a shared authentication dependency we didn't know about?" Delgado asked, already sounding like he doubted his own question. "It shouldn't," Zoe said. "I reviewed the dependency map before we deployed, but shouldn't isn't good enough right now." She rubbed her eyes. "Nguyen, pull the external connection logs for the 2 hours before the patch went live. I want to know if anything touched our network from outside that we didn't authorize." Nguyen worked in silence for a while, and the silence stretched long enough that Zoe made herself stop watching his screen and go check the masterboard again, as if red squares might have changed color if she looked away. "Ma'am," Nguyen's voice had changed. "There's an external connection attempt logged at 0312, 35 minutes before the patch finished deploying. It got rejected by the firewall. Looks like it never got in. But it hit the same authentication service that failed at 0347. The room went quiet in the ordinary way, not the dramatic way. Just 4 people doing math in their heads. "So someone tried the door 35 minutes before it broke," Okafor said. "Or someone tried the door, failed, and their attempt happened to line up with a system that broke on its own for unrelated reasons 35 minutes later," Zoe said. "I'm not ruling that out. I don't have enough here to call this an attack. But I don't have enough to call it an accident either, and that's the part I have to tell Reyes." She looked at the clock. 06:23. Still more than an hour before she owed him something solid, and what she had instead was a question mark with 2 ugly possibilities hanging off it. "What I do know," she said, mostly to herself, "is that we can't fix what we don't understand, and we don't have time to fully understand it before people need to talk to each other again." She looked at her team. "So we're going to work 2 problems at once. Okafor and Nguyen. Keep digging into whether this was deliberate. I need that answer for the colonel and for whoever he has to call above him. Delgado, you're with me. We're going to see if there's any way to get these units talking again without waiting for the primary systems to come back, because right now, I don't trust that they will." Delgado hesitated. "Ma'am, if primary and redundant are both compromised or corrupted, what's left?" Zoe didn't have an answer yet. But she had a phone number in her contacts she hadn't used for anything but birthdays in a long time, and a growing, uncomfortable feeling that she was about to need it. The primary system's rollback failed at 0658. Zoe had pinned her hopes on it without quite admitting that to herself. Revert to the last known good configuration. Bring East and West back the way they'd been before the patch touched them. Apologize to Reyes for the scare, and spend the next week figuring out what had actually gone wrong. Clean. Contained. The version of this morning she could live with. Instead, the rollback hung for 6 minutes, and then returned an error she'd never seen in 3 years of doing this job. The configuration it was trying to restore no longer matched anything the hardware recognized. Whatever had broken hadn't just knocked the systems offline. It had changed something underneath them. "That's not a patch bug," Okafor said quietly, reading over her shoulder. "A patch bug doesn't rewrite the thing it's supposed to be rolling back to." Zoe didn't answer right away, because answering meant saying out loud that this had moved from probably an accident to something she could no longer promise Reyes with a straight face. She tried the redundant system next, telling herself it was worth the 10 minutes, even though some part of her already knew. It failed the same way. Different error text, same shape of problem. The ground itself had shifted, not just what was sitting on it. 46 minutes until Reyes came back through that door expecting an answer. She stepped into the small side office off the operations floor, shut the door most of the way, and called her father. Chief Warrant Officer Daniel Bennett had retired 11 years ago after a career spent almost entirely in communications. First as a young sergeant running field wire in places that didn't exist on unclassified maps. Later as the guy other units called when nothing else worked. He picked up on the third ring, his voice thick with sleep and immediately alert anyway, the way it always went when his daughter called before 7 in the morning. "Zoe, everything okay? I need to ask you something, and I don't have a lot of time to explain why. Go." If a base's primary and redundant secure comms both went down at once, not damaged, just unreachable, and the usual fallback won't take a rollback, is there anything left? Something old. Something that wouldn't show up on a current systems list. There was a pause on the line, the kind that meant he was actually thinking instead of just talking. "What post?" "Caldwell." "Caldwell." He said it slowly, like he was turning the word over. "Caldwell still has the Hollow Ridge relay. Or it did, last I knew. We built that thing back in the 90s. Hybrid analog-digital relay, hardened, meant to survive exactly the kind of scenario where your fancy stuff goes dark all at once. It was never officially decommissioned, as far as I know. Just stopped being anybody's job to maintain. Things like that don't get removed, they get forgotten. Would it still work? I have no idea," he said honestly. "Nobody's touched it in 20 years, best I know. It's not built like your system, Zoe. No software patches, no network stack you'd recognize. If half your team's never seen equipment like that, they're going to be lost the first 10 minutes just figuring out what they're looking at." Zoe closed her eyes. This was not the answer she wanted. It was old, undocumented, unowned by anyone currently on staff, and using it meant walking into Reyes's next question, "What's your plan?" with something that sounded less like a plan and more like a legend she'd heard from her dad. "Where would I even find documentation on it?" "You probably won't," he said. "I might remember more than any manual that's still lying around. If you want, I'll talk you through what I recall. But Zoe, I want to be straight with you. I'm describing something from memory, from a long time ago. I could be wrong about parts of it." "I know." "Then why do I hear you already deciding to try it?" "Because the alternative was telling Colonel Reyes, in 40 minutes, that she had nothing. That 2,000 soldiers were going to stay unreachable for however long it took to properly diagnose and rebuild two systems that had both failed in ways she didn't yet understand. Because doing nothing while she chased the clean, fixable answer felt suddenly like the same mistake as the river crossing 2 years ago, waiting for the right solution instead of using the one that was actually available. "Because it's the only door I've got left that isn't locked," she said. Her father was quiet for a second. "Okay, get something to write with. And Zoe, if you go pull that equipment, don't do it alone and don't do it without telling your colonel exactly what it is before you flip anything on. Old gear like that doesn't forgive being surprised." She grabbed a legal pad off the desk, and for the next 12 minutes her father talked her through what he remembered of a relay system built before she'd finished high school, where it should physically sit, roughly how it powered up, what the handful of switches on its face were supposed to do, and the 2 ways he remembered it failing if you got the startup sequence wrong. When she hung up, she had 4 pages of handwritten notes, a system nobody on her team had ever operated, and 31 minutes before she had to walk out and tell Reyes this was the plan. She looked at the notes for a long moment. Then she picked up the radio to call Okafor and Delgado back in. Colonel Reyes arrived at 0700 exactly, and Zoe met him before he'd fully crossed the threshold, because she decided somewhere in the last 30 minutes that the worst thing she could do was let him ask the question before she'd already started answering it. "Sir, primary and redundant systems are both down at a level deeper than the patch. Something changed at the configuration layer that neither rollback recognizes. We don't have a clean fix, and we don't have a timeline for one." She kept her voice level, the way she'd trained herself to during 4 years of briefings that mattered less than this one. "We do have another option. It's not a good one, but it's real." Reyes's face didn't change much, which she'd learned over 18 months meant he was listening hard, not that he was calm. "I'm listening. There's a legacy relay system on this post, Hollow Ridge, built in the 90s, hardened, analog hybrid. It was never formally decommissioned, just abandoned in place. Nobody currently on staff has operated it. I have no technical manual. What I have is 40 minutes of second-hand memory from a retired warrant officer who helped install systems like it, and 4 pages of notes I wrote down an hour ago. You're telling me your plan is a system nobody's touched in 20 years, based on notes from a phone call. I'm telling you it's the only path I can offer you that doesn't require me to promise you a timeline I can't back up." She held his gaze. "I could keep working the primary system and hope we find the real fix in the next few hours. I think that's a real risk to units that are currently unreachable during live maneuvers. I'd rather gamble on something old that might work than sit on something modern that currently doesn't." Reyes was quiet for 3 full seconds, which felt considerably longer. "You have until 1000, he said. "If Hollow Ridge doesn't work, I'm elevating this above both of us, and I start planning around the assumption that our exercise units are on their own until further notice. Go." The relay building sat at the edge of the post's old motor pool, a squat concrete structure with a rusted padlock that took Delgado 4 tries with bolt cutters borrowed from motor pool maintenance. Inside, the air smelled like dust and old insulation. Zoe swept her flashlight over rows of equipment racks that looked nothing like the server stacks she was used to. Heavy metal chassis, dial gauges, thick cable bundles secured with cloth tape that had gone brittle with age. "Ma'am," Okafor said, quiet, "I don't recognize half of this." "Neither do I," Zoe admitted. "That's why we're going slow." She opened her notes. "Dad said the main power feed should be on a separate breaker, labeled in a panel to the left of the equipment bay. If it's not labeled anymore, we look for a breaker that doesn't match the numbering on anything else in the building." They found it, unlabeled, exactly as he'd warned. Delgado hesitated with his hand on it. "If we throw this and it's the wrong thing, could it damage the equipment?" "Possibly," Zoe said. "We don't have time to be certain of everything. We have time to be as careful as we can and accept some risk." She checked her notes again, checked the wiring visually against what her father had described, and then nodded. "Throw it." The lights on the equipment rack didn't come on with the confident, instant response Zoe was used to from modern hardware. Instead, there was a low mechanical hum, a pause long enough to make her stomach drop, and then a slow amber glow crawling up a row of dial indicators, one at a time, like something waking up after a long sleep. "That's power," Okafor said, cautious relief in her voice. "That's not the same as it working." Zoe called her father back on speaker, notes spread across a dusty console. "We've got power. Now what?" His voice, tinny through the phone speaker, walked her through a startup sequence. A specific order of switches, a warm-up period he insisted they not rush no matter how much the clock was pressing, a set of dial readings that needed to sit in a certain range before they tried transmitting anything. Twice Zoe caught herself reaching for a switch too soon and made herself stop, made herself wait, because her father's voice on the other end kept repeating the same warning. "This equipment doesn't forgive being rushed." At 0847, with 113 minutes left before Reyes's deadline, the dial readings settled where they were supposed to. "Okay," her father said. "If everything I remember is right, and if that equipment's held up the way it should have, try a test transmission now, short. See if you get anything back." Zoe looked at Okafor. Okafor looked at Delgado. Nobody said anything for a second, because everyone in that dusty concrete room understood, without needing it spoken out loud, that this was the moment where either 2 decades of forgotten equipment had quietly kept working in the dark, or it hadn't, and there wasn't a third option left to try. Zoe pressed the transmit switch. Static hissed out of an old speaker mounted above the console, rough, uneven, nothing like the clean digital audio she was used to. And then, faint, breaking up, but unmistakably a human voice. "Unidentified station, this is Bravo 6-2, say again, who is this?" For a second, nobody in the relay building moved. Then Okafor let out a breath that was half laugh, half something closer to relief, so sharp it hurt. And Delgado was already reaching for a pad to write down the call sign. Zoe grabbed the handset her father had told her to look for, mounted on a bracket beside the console, and keyed it with a hand that wasn't quite steady. Bravo 6-2, this is Fort Caldwell Network Operations, transmitting on the Hollow Ridge relay. Say your status over. The reply came back broken by static, words dropping in and out, but the shape of it was clear enough. Bravo 6-2 was fine. Confused, cut off from higher for the better part of 4 hours, running their scheduled movements on their own initiative because that was what they'd been trained to do when contact went dark. But fine. No injuries. No incidents. They'd assumed, reasonably, that the outage was on their end. Zoe felt something in her chest loosen that she hadn't fully realized was clenched. Over the next 40 minutes, using a relay system her father had helped install before she was old enough to remember, Zoe and her team re-established contact with each of the exercise's scattered units, one at a time, patient and careful. The amber dials on the old console glowing steady the whole time like they'd simply been waiting for someone to ask. Every unit reported the same thing: cut off, uncertain, but safe. Nobody hurt, nobody lost. The exercise had continued in a rougher, more improvised form than planned, run by junior leaders making their own calls in the absence of higher guidance, which, Zoe thought, watching Delgado relay grid coordinates in a voice gone hoarse with relief, was in its own way exactly what field training was supposed to build in people. Colonel Reyes arrived at Hollow Ridge at 09:30, 30 minutes ahead of his own deadline, drawn by the radio traffic Zoe had routed to also reach the main operations center. He stood in the doorway of the old relay building for a long moment, looking at the dusty equipment rack glowing amber in the dim light, and at his cybersecurity captain standing in front of it with a handwritten set of notes and a headset pressed to one ear. All units accounted for, Zoe told him before he could ask. Nobody hurt. We're relaying position and status reports now. It's not elegant, sir, and it's not fast, but it's working. Reyes exhaled, something in his shoulders coming down for the first time since 0400. How long can it hold? I don't know yet. My father's still on the phone, and Sergeant Okafor's charting how long the equipment's holding steady. We'll know more in an hour. She hesitated, then added the part she'd been rehearsing since the amber dials first lit up. Sir, I take responsibility for the primary and redundant systems going down. I approved the update timeline. We'll get into that, Reyes said, not unkindly. After. Right now, you've got units back in contact for the first time in 5 hours, using a piece of equipment nobody remembered we owned. Let's not undersell that part yet. By early afternoon, Okafor's team had traced the real cause of the failure back to a dependency the original vulnerability audit hadn't flagged. An authentication service shared between the primary and redundant systems in a way the architecture diagrams hadn't shown, exposed by the patch and then further corrupted by the same unauthorized connection attempt Nguyen had found logged at 0312. Not a coordinated attack in the way Zoe had feared at 0400. Someone probing the network from outside, opportunistic rather than targeted, who had gotten nowhere near actually getting in, but whose failed attempt had collided, by bad luck in a blind spot in the update review, with a patch rollout that made that blind spot catastrophic instead of harmless. It wasn't the answer that made Zoe feel good. It confirmed the update timeline she'd signed off on had a gap in it, a real one, sitting in her own review process. But it was an answer she could stand behind, and one that came with something to actually fix. That evening, with the primary system undergoing a full rebuild and Hollow Ridge still humming quietly in the background as backup, Zoe sat on the edge of a folding chair in the relay building and called her father again, this time with no crisis pressing on either end of the line. It worked, she said. All of it, exactly the way you described. I wasn't sure it would, he admitted. Most of that was memory older than you are. I know. That's what scared me about using it. She looked at the old console, the dials still glowing faint amber, patient in a way none of her modern systems had ever managed to be. I think I've been telling myself for 2 years that being good at this job meant never letting anything get that bad in the first place, never needing the backup plan. And now I think being good at it means knowing the backup plan exists and being willing to use it, even when it means walking into your commanding officer's office and admitting your first 2 systems failed. She paused. Reyes wants Hollow Ridge formally recommissioned, documented properly this time, maintained. He said we shouldn't need to get lucky with a phone call to make it work next time. Her father laughed, quiet and warm. Damn right you shouldn't. Outside, the exercise was winding down for the day. Units moving back toward their staging areas under a communications system that was, for the moment, held together by patched software and a piece of decades-old hardware nobody had planned on needing. Zoe stayed a while longer in the relay building after the call ended, notebook still open on the console beside her, listening to the low hum of equipment that had waited 20 years to be useful again, and thinking that some of the most important things a person builds are the ones nobody remembers to thank until the day everything else goes quiet. And that's Captain Zoe Bennett's story. The night every system failed, and the one nobody remembered saved them. Thank you for watching until the end. If this story moved you, hit like and subscribe so you don't miss what's coming next. See you in the next one.